Good evening. My name is Matthew Ogden, and thank you for joining us tonight with our May 23rd, 2014 live webcast from LaRouchepack.com. We're featuring Mr. Lyndon Larouche tonight, who is here in the studio with me, and I'm also joined by Creighton Cody Jones from the LaRouche Pack Science team, and we have a series of questions for Mr. Larouche. Now, we're going to begin with a question that has come in from an institutional contact, and it's a subject which is, I know, very close to Lynn's heart. So I'm going to begin by reading this. It reads as follows. Mr. Larouche, the recent landslide victory of Modi and the BJP in the Indian elections is quite significant. Even though Mr. Modi has been barred from coming to the United States in the past, President Obama immediately invited him to visit the White House. The U.S. Navy is moving to deepen collaboration with the Indian Navy. These actions do not necessarily define a positive U.S. policy approach to India by any means. You have visited India many times. You had a close relationship with Mrs. Indira Gandhi and with other Indian leaders, including many leading Indian national security figures. What type of U.S.-India relationship would you promote?
Well, that's easy for me. Because when Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi, was assassinated by the British, and that's what happened, her assassination destroyed the continuity of the original successful Indian Revolution of independence. Her father had been very significant, but she was most significant. My first knowledge of her was when she had been a younger woman, actually almost a girl, and she had been entertained by great people in Europe. She had been studying in Switzerland. And the great leader of France of her time was one who appreciated this woman is, appraising her just because of her ability. But that's another one of my old friends who's dead long since. But I had a very close relationship, as Helga did also, with her. We visited her a number of times. We were in touch with her in various reasons. And I was in a court case at the time. I received the notice with a really insulting thing. In this case of what I was pleading. And they laughed at the fact that my friend Indira Gandhi had been assassinated. It shows you the kind of people from that region of Virginia, what they're like, especially the legal department. So, what I know is, though I had many friends in India, and some still surviving today, but the ones that I know the best are from my own time, and they go in the period before the parts of the war and afterward. Now, what this means is essentially Modi. His appointment tends to suggest, and in other words, in these kinds of cases, you never know exactly what's going to happen. But the opinion of those I know and what I get from the process suggests that Modi is a man who is actually dedicated to close in on what had been the broken connection from Indira Gandhi. I mean, Indira's children were not great statesmen. They were good people, but they were not great statesmen. And we had a lot of problems later on. We had institutions in India which were always good institutions. I had close relations with them, as I'd had, with other places. And for example, with Japan, we had people in Japan who were my cooperators in dealing with other areas, the Mitsubishi firm at that time, particularly the Coral Canal. There were other Japanese who were working out of with the intention of the canal, the Panama Canal, a new Panama Canal direction. This is one of my first personal contacts with a leading Japanese businessman. So, now what does this all mean? What it means, if we can assume, which is the fact that Modi was not popular with the U.S. or the other British, which is a very good sign. So therefore, what this means is that India is now falling into place under Modi as a partner with Russia and China. Which this means that the most important nations of Asia and Eurasia, the most important nations, the most important powers, take the population size of India, take the population size of China, take the other fringe areas of Eurasia in that area who are friendly, apart from the Islamic community. The Islamic communities tend to be contaminated with the British influence, and therefore the Saudi Arabia is most typical of the criminality among the Saudi and Islamic community. But so therefore this means that now you have an integration between China and Russia, a very functional one. This extends into Africa, it extends into other parts of the world. India is coming into quite naturally into play, despite the problems with Pakistan and nearby Pakistan, inside India. Despite those problems, you have a great portion of the population of this planet is actually, in part, with Russia, China, India, and other countries of that region. So you have a major part of the powers of the planet are located in the populations there. Secondly, the trend in the transatlantic region is since about 1970, or even before. The United States, South America, and Europe have been declining since about 1970. In other words, the interval between the assassination of John F. Kennedy and then the next step at 1971, where the crisis occurred, where the U.S. economy, since 1971, the actual physical economy of the United States has been in a consistent trend of decline. Similarly, Europe, Western and Central Europe, have been in a period of decline since about the same time. South America is in decline and has been ever since then. So that now the western part of the world, the transatlantic part of the world, is now in a fatal kind of decline. Now, the situation is now that if I have my druthers, in terms of people who, in important positions inside the United States, agree with my policies, including the kind of policies you would associate with Bill Clinton today, which he would tend toward. Those policies, as perfected by me, because I have an integral relationship with that president, and therefore we have a sort of reciprocal relationship of a very funny nature, but it's a very efficient nature. And therefore with Bill Clinton coming in as potentially the reviver of the Democratic Party from its doldrums under the beasts which we had recently, including Obama, that the fact that the Republican Party may have useful individuals in it, but the mass of the Democratic Party, if brought together with its now hatred, where about 3/4 of the American citizenry hates Obama, absolutely hates him. They're afraid to take him on, but they hate him. And they hate him more and more as time passes. Now with what Keisha is doing, And don't underestimate what the world knows about Keisha. Forces around the world realize that what Keisha is doing as a candidate, qualified to be the winner, if she gets a fair shot at getting the votes counted properly, that this Keisha's selection, even an interim selection, as the new senator from Texas, would mean a revolution in the politics of the United States. Right now, we're in that vicinity. Even if she doesn't quite make it, she's still a factor. For the western states of the United States, south of the Canadian border, and that is the northern tier of the Canadian border, is a different area. But the water-scarce area of the western states of the United States depends upon a water program which we're going to have to develop, because we can't do NWAPA anymore. There isn't enough water in the system to maintain a NWAPA program, except in Canada or some parts of the northern. But you cannot maintain a water system under these present conditions. We're going to have to get out of the green policy, because under the green policy there is no hope for the survival of the United States. And the British know that. They're our enemy, the British Empire. It's our enemy. It's the enemy of all decent people on this planet. There may be some decent Brits in there somewhere in the woodwork, but the British monarchy is an obscene, satanic force. And I do not exaggerate when I say satanic. Because Zeus, who's the author of the Roman Empire, and the author also of the British Empire, is otherwise known as Satan. And believe me, this British monarchy, especially that of the Crescent Queen and her family, immediate family, is satanic. Our policy is what? Reduce the population of the planet, cause mass deaths, starvation, killing, destroy crops, destroy landed areas, destroy the landed area on which people could live in order to reduce the population from 7 billion people, which was our initial goal, down to less than 1. This woman is satanic. Those actions and the expressed intention to promote those actions are satanic. So now what we would have here is, in the Eurasian area, we have 3 keystone nations, among others. These 3 keystone nations represent, in the eastern part of the hemisphere, in the Eurasian part, represent the foundations for the building up of a new development of mankind on the planet. Because if we, in the United States, do what I have proposed to Bill Clinton and others, how we can do this, the 4 points based on Alexander Hamilton's design. That if we actually proceed to deal with the increase of the physical potential of productivity, increase energy flux density according to the American population, get rid of the British grip on our republic. Remember, most presidents of the United States were filth. They were British stooges, either as British agents as such. Woodrow Wilson was an agent of hell. And so was another different Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was a product of the Confederacy. And Theodore Roosevelt was developed by the mass killer based in London of the Confederacy. We have a whole string of presidents who either were cowardly, cringing before British power, British influence, and the United States, which is corrupted by the acceptance of the states' rights, because states' rights was the instrument by which the British Empire was able to destroy and corrupt and subvert the national income. Take the case of Wall Street. Wall Street is an institution which should not exist. Yes, there are banks in the United States, which are commercial banks. insofar as they're banks which would be certifiable by the Treasury Secretaries of the United States, as Lincoln did in the case of the Civil War. What Lincoln did, Abraham Lincoln did as president, he did exactly the same thing that was done by Alexander Hamilton. It was Hamilton's policy that the legitimate banks within the territory of the United States, and this is a crucial thing, part of what I'm talking about here, banks in the United States which meet the standard of the Constitution of the United States should not be held accountable to foreign sources or foreign. The United States is a unit, was intended to be a unit, not a collection of separate states, not a federalized system, but a federal system in which each state would not have free rights to engage in foreign trade behind the back of the United States. And it's the fact that the United States was, since John Adams and other presidents, has been an agent of foreign forces on the basis of the state's demand for access to special privileges abroad behind the back of the United States. That's how we were corrupted. We didn't have a decent president after President Franklin, Benjamin Franklin and Company, and George Washington. We didn't have a president who was fit for shucks until Monroe and John Quincy Adams. We had evil presidents right after that. Who were all British agents. Alexander Hamilton was killed by order of the British king. Was done through New York City, which was at that time already a cesspot of treason. They were all working as agents of British and related foreign banks. And it was a foreign trade under a free trade system which enabled the British Empire to move in on and grab control of the economy of the United States, internal economy of the United States, by states' rights, trade, foreign trade. So the issue now is that if we understand that we have to eliminate states' rights and say you have only national rights, that every state has a rightful participation in national rights. The trade is not with foreign countries. The trade is through the instrument of the United States, a virtual Secretary of State of the United States, which was the Lincoln solution. And it was the assassination of Lincoln, which was done personally and directly by the British monarchy. Who did it? They organized the assassination of him in Canada. They assembled Confederate agents and others, agents. They assembled them in Canada and catered a string of operations throughout what had been the United States, including many assassinations, but most prominently the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln immobilized the United States until a president who was assassinated to make room for Teddy Roosevelt. We had two decent presidents in the 20th century, only two, who never served more than one term, and one term he was assassinated before he could do that. And until Franklin Roosevelt. As soon as Franklin Roosevelt was dead, Wall Street took over, which meant the British Empire would take over. And where President Roosevelt had negotiated a solid agreement with Stalin, the minute the little pig Truman got a Wall Street warts in place, Truman, under British orders, started an attempt for an immediate World War III operation. And the intention was, by Bertrand Russell, who was organizing this, was a nuclear war against the Soviet Union and other nations. And that was increased in development by work with Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell organized the upgrading from a nuclear war, an augmented nuclear war, to a thermonuclear war. And what happened is John F. Kennedy, as president, stopped that war successfully. So John F. Kennedy was assassinated for that reason. And as soon as John F. Kennedy was efficiently killed, murdered, then you had his vice president was all fibbity, knowing he was next on the target list. And Kennedy, who had prevented, together with a great general, had been eliminated too by death. He just died. But then the president himself, who's the vice president, now the president, said I can't do anything because I see the guns pointed at my neck next. So that president, Lyndon Johnson, was not a bad guy, but he saw when he saw what was around him, where it was coming from the Wall Street and British crowd, he knew he did not have a chance. So he got involved in a bleeding war in Indochina, which President had prevented. So they killed him in order to have the war in Indochina, because the war in Indochina could not have happened unless that was made possible by the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So therefore, the problem we have is, as you see today, we have the presidents under George Bush Jr., totally British, all totally British agents. They're not American. They have no American loyalty whatsoever. They're British agents. El Cheapo, Wall Street side. Obama is practically comes out of the rear end of the Queen of England. And all of the things that we get from England, Britain, are generally come from the same rear end. So now the point is, if we take these things into account, and if we can actually get Obama out of office, he should be thrown out of office and thrown into prison to prevent two things: to prevent him from being assassinated. We don't want him assassinated under any circumstances. Much better, more advantageous to the United States and its interest, was put him in the Hooskow for his crimes, where he belongs, keep him there as a permanent obstacle of attention from inside prison, and a reminder of what evil is by his image being shown repeatedly in suitable times. And then we can go back to the business of being the United States. And because of this development potential of the Eurasian sector, typified by Russia, typified by China, and now by India as the prospect of this new election, Modi election, means that we have an international alliance potential among nations in Europe, such as for Germany, for example, where the majority of the people in Germany are against a war against Russia, and other nations which are controlled by evil, stupid jerks will give in. Italy has a factor readiness to make a new agreement. It's already being discussed. A restoration of the economic system, Glass-Steagall, a Glass-Steagall law for Italy. Now France, with its point, might drift toward a de Gaulle tradition, which still exists in France, except French can be bought too easily. French politicians are too easily purchased, particularly when the British are spreading the money. So under those circumstances, this would mean that we would have, with the United States, if we support what Clinton's backing would help, to bring the Democratic Party back into the fold of the nation, the United States, outside the strange places to which they have wandered. And there we would have a new period. Because a new period of history which would mean that war as we have known it, as general warfare, will never again occur on this planet. There will be police actions where necessary to restrain evildoers, but this will be by the general community of nations, which says these restraints must be imposed. But no imposition against the rights of sovereignty of the respective nations otherwise. The purpose is to have an economic policy which is consistent with the nature of mankind. Mankind is not an animal, though mankind is treated as an animal by most governments, by the government of the United States, treats our people as cattle, to be trashed, as by Obama, who has written most of the U.S. population living still today as trash, to be killed on the altar of the British Queen, the imperial altar of the British Queen. She said so herself. I'm not saying it. I'm merely observing what she has said. So therefore, we represent, if we in the United States do our job of leadership and take the opportunities presented to us and find, even within the Democratic Party leadership, sufficient leaders who will understand that this has to be done. That doesn't mean the Republicans are useless. It means the Republican Party has an arrogant attitude about things, which is kind of stupid. And once we get this thing in order, you'll find most of the Republicans will tend to go along with us on this thing. If we reunite the United States around a proper standpoint, as we should be able to do so, in that case, we have ended war in the sense of general warfare from this planet. And we will have launched a period of increase of the energy flux density available to the productive powers of mankind. We will kill the green policy, which is murdering our people. No more green policy. We want crops to grow. We want the power of mankind to increase. You want the energy flux density in the hands of every person to increase. We want the educational powers, the intellectual powers, the nomadic intellectual powers of creativity to increase. And say, never again. Never, never again on this planet will this planet be subjected to the tyranny of the character whose name sometimes Zeus, more familiar to us through the Roman Empire and the British Empire as Satan himself. And that is the great mission. Now the Indian Navy and the U.S. Navy and so forth, cooperation together with the China Navy and other naval forces, can help one another to have an order in the planet which will enable us to do our next mission. Our next mission is to move into space, which is the thing I'm interested in, which is why I'm so concerned with the Vanansky part. Vanansky has implicitly opened the gates of reason to the future of mankind, not only within Earth, but in the neighborhood of Earth. We as people, as a species, have no qualifications for living outside of Earth's protection. However, we have within our planet the means to strengthen our own beings within our planet itself. We can also control the moon to very great advantage for all concerned. But then we have the means. We don't have to use vessels to protect us against asteroids. We have available to us through higher instruments than the sun itself commands. Mankind has presently at his disposition principles of action, of thermonuclear action. These principles give man power, greater power than the sun itself in the solar system, when applied. And therefore the development of man's powers to exist mean that mankind in the future will have the power to control dangers from nearby parts of the solar system and beyond. Mankind is capable of realizing things that no living creature before that we know of has ever known. And it's this conception of mankind as a power within the solar system, which has corresponding responsibilities for support of the maintenance of the solar system, that when the sun begins to wane and seems to fade, we as mankind will have in our minds the design for methods of power by which we can sustain the solar system itself before it could die.
Well, let me ask a question about the British monarchy. Several weeks ago, you had warned that with the political disintegration of their stooge, Obama, the British monarchy themselves would be forced to activate their efforts to provoke thermonuclear war in a much more open and upfront manner, in their own names. And this week we've seen several examples of just this shift. A press release was posted on the LaRouchePAC website this Wednesday titled "British Crown Declares War," which details renewed attacks emanating from London against you personally, and also implicating and affecting candidates associated with you, both Keisha Rogers and Michael Steger. And at the same time, the heir to the British throne, the British crown, Prince Charles, during a trip to Canada, made a widely publicized verbal attack against President Vladimir Putin, comparing Putin to Adolf Hitler. Now, this turned out to be a very ill-advised move, seeing as the British royals themselves have a very embarrassing family history vis-a-vis the Nazis. And since Russia lost an estimated 27 million people, Soviet citizens, fighting to defeat Adolf Hitler in World War II. Not to mention the fact that it's the British today who are openly supporting avowed neo-Nazis in Ukraine. So the monarchy is now experiencing some pretty heavy blowback for these remarks, and global attention, including inside Russia, is finally being focused on the appropriate enemy, the British royal family. The Russian Foreign Ministry issued a statement expressing its outrage. They said, "These words do not reflect well on the future British monarch. We view the use of the Western press by members of the British royal family to spread a propaganda campaign against Russia as unacceptable, outrageous, and low. It is very serious. Every family in our country lost someone in that war." And the Russian newspaper Pravda published a very apropos story saying, well, if we want to talk about the British royal family, the issue of Nazi themes arises with them first. In 2006, the young Prince Harry appeared at a costume party in the form of a soldier in Rommel's army with a swastika armband on his arm. Not to mention the fact that Prince Charles's great-uncle, King Edward VIII, was a Nazi sympathizer. And then, very significantly, today, Russia Today published a story which elaborates in depth the Nazi pedigree of Prince Philip, who was educated at a Nazi school and whose sisters all married SS officers and joined the Nazi party. This article also highlights the allegations that Prince Charles was involved in the assassination of his former wife, Princess Diana, citing the recently released film Unlawful Killing. Now, to get to the question, perhaps most significantly, this RT article that I just mentioned asks a very appropriate and optimistic question, which in turn I would like to pose to you. Are we witnessing the death throes of the British monarchy?
I would hope so. And specifically, they deserve it. And the best way to do it is, you see, the problems you have, the American people generally, and the people in most of Europe, are cowards. Now, they're cowards because they've been defeated so many times, and because the British system of fake money dominates the planet. Now, therefore, my economic policy for the United States now, and it would be a highly successful economic policy. You know, if I simply had in hand what I already know and have planned and proposed, what I have proposed so far fully accounts for a restoration of the United States to its full sovereignty, which it does not have now. Right? Wall Street is a fraud. That is the special office. You have Wall Street. It contains two elements in banking. One element is banking as such, state-by-state banking, and national banks in some cases. But the Wall Street speculative element, which has taken over since the cancellation of Glass-Steagall, is something which must be ripped out of the U.S. system. That is, Wall Street as such, the speculative instrument, which has always been a British instrument since before the American Revolution. In other words, before the Tories inside what became the United States were all British agents, not American patriots. New York City, the Dutch interest, financial interest in New York City area, what we call the New York City area today, were typical of the British interest because the Anglo-Dutch system was one thing. They were always the same. The tilt was the original form of the system was the Dutch. The Dutch committed mass murders throughout the world. Then the Dutch which created the entire span of evil during the course of that century, then gave way to forming itself, the Dutch interest, formed what became known as the British Empire. That's what the killing of the Irish was done about. It was done by the Dutch, who invaded the United Kingdom, what we call the United Kingdom today, and went into Ireland and conducted a homicidal mass killing of the Irish. That's the birth of the British Empire. It was the mass killing of the Dutch, of the Irish. And the Scots were not treated too well either. And my ancestors, I have some Scottish ancestors, you know, and they knew all about this thing. And some of them were real fighters. They were Scottish dragoons of the Clan MacFarlane and the Weir of MacFarlane. And this is on my side of my family, you know. And we have the French side of my family, which is sort of French-Canadian mostly. And they also tend to be a little bit spunky at times. My grandfathers were very spunky. Grandfather, great-grandfather on the paternal side. My Scottish grandfather, who became a priest, a Protestant priest, was nonetheless drawn from the blood of Scottish cavalrymen with their great sabers. And he still carried that saber when he traveled around among he was the first around the cavalry. He was in that there, volunteered for the defense of the Union. And after they'd won the war, then he took to drinking. A Scottish problem, you see. He's had a brother who did not drink so much, who was a sea captain. But he was a drinking man, and he had a great saber. And my great-grandmother, his wife, conspired with others, including his brother, the sea captain, to take the saber away because it was threatening the natives of the area. So this is the kind of thing we had. But the point was, the cause was the United States. To get free Ireland and Scotland and so forth, get them free of the damn British Empire as they had come to know it. And so they would often volunteer to come into what was the United States and would support us essentially in the Civil War period. And so we have an American tradition, which is not just American as such. It's a tradition of those who saw the cause of the United States as being the cause of the people of Europe as well. It's the tradition of the American Revolution, and it echoes into the period of Abraham Lincoln. And that's where we are today. We're at that point. What we need is a system which eliminates the system of filth and waste, which is the British system of monetarism. We have to exterminate monetarism from the planet, especially beginning from the United States. We do not use money as value. We use denominations, which we call money, in trade, such that things which are better will command a slightly higher price than things that were less, which was the system designed by Alexander Hamilton. That system, which is the system around which the United States was formed as an entity, that system is what we need back again. And that is what the rest of the world needs, the same kind of system. No more speculative on money per se. Money has no intrinsic value. The only value is its use as a reflection of the improvement in the physical conditions of productivity and life. If it does not match better, it ain't true. So the point is, the population of the human species must always increase the power of the human species as a species on this planet. That's the principle. It's the same principle of life. Only the human species is capable of increasing its power in nature. No other species has an intrinsic ability to increase its power in nature. This is called chemistry. When chemistry is understood as the increase of the energy flux density expressed in the mind of mankind. And that's what we have to educate a lot of people who are ignorant of this. And by educating them and giving them a taste of what this all means, we can initiate and maintain on this planet a standard of social relations among nations and within nations which will suit our purpose.
Okay, Lynn. I'd like to pose a question that hopefully gets at how do we start to bring about the necessary changes that you're indicating here. There was a study that was put out in early April, but it's starting to get a lot of traction in the press, picked up by a number of authors, including Paul Craig Roberts, commented on this. And it was a study done by a professor at Princeton and another one at Northwestern, where effectively what they did is they looked at, they did a survey over a 20-year period of different opinion polls in the populace about what their political preferences were, what the majority of people preferred politically, economically, and otherwise, and compared what was popular opinion, popular preference, to what became actual policy during that period. And in effect, what it demonstrated was that the majority never got what they wanted, and they concluded it was always a very small handful of very wealthy, of business elites who in effect were shaping policy. And so they said their conclusion was the United States is not a democracy, we are in fact an oligarchy. Now, the problem is a lot of the response to that has been, or the reaction on the part of people like Roberts and others, is that this is because of the collapse of the unions, and maybe we could get back the power of the unions if we brought back things like a green jobs initiative and what have you, that would build up the middle class and etc. Which is, as we've discussed, as you pointed out, going green is not the way to go. That would actually accelerate the collapse of the United States and accelerate the death rates. So part of the question is, one, what really should be the direction that we should go in terms of how do we build up the industrial working class base of the United States to get a certain kind of political power back into the people. But also I think broader is that this study seems to indicate that popular opinion really doesn't have power, as you've always said. That it's not a question of what does the populace want. So if it's not popular opinion, or the idea that if you just get enough information in enough people's hands, that will bring about change, if that's not actually how it works, how do you in fact change history? Or has history changed up to this point? If not through popular opinion, what really does move history?
Well, we have an example of that in action among certain presidents. Now we have President Monroe understood, perhaps not perfectly, the intention of Alexander Hamilton, or we call him Major General Hamilton, who had the title after he had become, the head of the Secretary of State. And Lincoln simply adopted the policies of Hamilton, which were also the policies of John Quincy Adams and the policies exactly of John Quincy Adams' student, Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. And what did they do? They created an entirely new currency backed by a government, the government of the Union at that time, under Lincoln, which had no money. They printed a money which is called greenbacks. The principle of greenbacks was that of Alexander Hamilton's design for the United States economy, which was echoed and copied with the Monroe, John Quincy Adams administration, which created a system of banks, which we would call today the equivalent of branch national banks. So a system of national banks, which were subsidiary national banks, as the instruments of credit, based on Alexander Hamilton's principle that the increase of the productivity of labor through technological progress and through the progress of improved trade, that is, by being able to move goods faster and making them better, was the process by which, with a highly successful development of the United States under what happened with Monroe and John Quincy Adams. At that point, the same person, a British agent, Aaron Burr, was funded by the British and New York area people in creating a fund of investment to buy the presidency of the United States by corruption. And what happened was we had a disaster then, a complete breakdown of the United States Constitution, which continued to resonate both by advocates of this crime and by presidents who were elected by kissing the butt of this criminal crime. So John Quincy Adams, up until 1948, was closely associated with Abraham Lincoln. And it was the Lincoln relationship which set into motion during that particular period of warfare, set into motion the plans given in the successive families of the original founders of the United States. And so therefore they went to work. The Confederacy, which is nothing but an instrument totally owned by the British Empire. Remember that Aaron Burr, the guy who was used as the financing instrument for bringing in the money in to bring the Jackson, Van Buren governments. This was done entirely by British agents and British money. They bought the election. They destroyed the banking system of the United States. They destroyed the credit of the United States. They bankrupted the United States totally under Van Buren. So therefore there was nothing workable in terms of the performance of the presidency until Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln's use of the Alexander Hamilton principle, which we called greenbacks at that point. The greenback instrument. All right, now the greenback instrument by the Union destroyed and defeated the British in the Civil War in the United States. Right? So what happened is President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, not by Aaron Burr, who was out of business at that time, but by surrogates for Aaron Burr, who were mobilized from advocates of the Confederacy and were organized directly by the British monarchy. The British monarchy created a chain of assassins, which included the assassination not only of President Abraham Lincoln, but many others. The assassination machine was also controlled by the nephew, I'll guess whom? Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. And now we had a president in between there who was not a stinker. He was an honest president. But then we had a direct representative of the Confederacy, Woodrow Wilson. It was Woodrow Wilson who organized the new operation against black people and others, and he organized that try to renew the Confederacy. Matter of fact, he reorganized the Ku Klux Klan in a ceremony performed inside the White House. And the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s was worse than the Ku Klux Klan had ever been before. You would find, for example, when people moved up from the South, cheap labor from southern states, they moved in and formed the Klan organization inside Detroit, for example, around the industry there. So this is how things happen. So the solution is to recognize that when you deviate from Hamiltonian principles, you invoke, especially with this idea of foreign trade operation, the principle must be absolutely that the United States must maintain a national currency and a national credit system, not state by state. Rather, each state will have its relationship to the national state for economic and related reasons, for means of trade and so forth. And therefore there will be no foreign speculator operating within the United States to undermine the economy of the United States. That means, first step, as I said last week, Glass-Steagall first. Without Glass-Steagall, you haven't got the building block on which to build the other elements of the structure. Once you do that, you have to set up a new system of credit, controlled as a federal credit system, which means you have to establish, once you have Glass-Steagall fully in view, you must go to another step. This other step is a national credit system. In other words, a national banking system, which will operate under the direction of the Secretary of the Treasury. This banking system will then be the credit system throughout the United States. In other words, all the banks in the United States will be sieved over. Those elements of the banks which are speculative will be denounced. Especially, you don't have any business in the United States. You're finished. Those parts of banks which are what we used to call commercial banks, or banks which function as if they were commercial banks. And they do actual banking, investment and so forth, in an equitable fashion. Those things we encourage and protect. But Wall Street, we just take with one sweep of a hand, trying to avoid the blood. You wipe out Wall Street. Just absolutely wipe it out. It gets nothing. Buddy, you had your lunch. Now get along. You ain't got nothing else coming to you. Now, if we do that, then we have other problems. First of all, we have a bankrupt nation. What do we do? What Abraham Lincoln did. We create a national credit system, like the greenbacks. Now, what happened is the greenback policy of Abraham Lincoln bankrupted all the foreign-owned banks in the United States. They no longer had control over the internal economy of the United States. We had as a result of that, we had the greatest industrial growth and boom in technology in the United States ever, in most of that period. Then these clowns went to work to worm their way back in by corrupt presidents, or stupid ones, and that's how we went. So then we got a good president who was assassinated in Buffalo, New York. And the Confederate boy, Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy called for fluff. And this fat slob, with his grunting and groaning, flew the nation. Woodrow Wilson continued the process. Harding was a guy who was killed, obviously. I mean, a guy who was reported as being fed live oysters crossing the desert, the great American desert, to the West Coast. And oysters did it. I don't think you have fresh oysters going at train speeds at that time in that way. So we got rid of him, and we had nothing but evil people as president until Franklin Roosevelt. As soon as Franklin Roosevelt was dead, the old evil came back, the old Wall Street evil came in again. The British ties came in again. Whereas President Roosevelt had agreements for peace throughout the planet, a whole organized system of peace throughout the planet, of virtually all nations. The minute he was dead, this stupid little jerk who had no middle name, he just had a letter. There's not even a period behind it. A little stupid little jerk, from Wall Street guy from the Midwest, and just jerk, stupid little nasty little jerk. And the British Empire took over. And the first thing they did is, by the end of that decade, the presidency of the United States had submitted itself under a very evil man, Bertrand Russell, to nuclear warfare globally, to a campaign of destruction of the United States, to persecutions, frame-ups, frauds on a mass scale, and divided the population into those who were security cleared and those who were not. And only people who kissed the butt of those who wanted to become wealthy were allowed to have the power of citizens. And those who did not kiss the butt of power were denied that. They got inferior jobs, inferior opportunity, perhaps no opportunity at all. The educational system of my universities in the United States turned into crap. And I experienced the tail end of that the education I was getting from a university I knew it was crap, but I also knew the whole thing was systemically crap. If you had one or two honest people in the faculty, they were the exceptions, or they didn't have much to do with economics. But in terms of science, there was no science in the universities. None. There was arithmetic, not sciences. And complicated schemes of arithmetic, but no physical science. So therefore we had the brains of our scientists were being destroyed by what was being called science. Today we have people out there who are leading in scientific programs, but they're not allowed to do much about shaping national policy. They're idiots. They're idiots who speculate in mere numbers. They use the number figures. They come up with decorative numbers. They call that science. It's no science. We have very few people in the United States who have actual qualifications of science among all of those who are listed as professors of science. We have only a dwindling few of our total scientific population per se, which actually has any qualification in science as such. Which means for us that our policy has to be, we have only a tiny fraction of the nominal scientific staffs of the United States presently. Because since the beginning of this last century, with what happened in France, what happened under the influence of Bertrand Russell, science was outrolled. We had Germany was the first victim. Germany went through the entire German population, which is now under tremendous pressure of occupation and similar things. They abandoned science and went over to arithmetic in the 1920s already. By the end of the 1920s, German science had been largely decimated as science and replaced by arithmetic and schemes of arithmetic. And that's where we are today. We have in the United States today almost a tiny margin of people who know what physical science means in practice. And this is a result of that great change. That's why the United States, as well as Western Europe, has been in a period of decline, the ability to produce and conceive. They become more and more stupid, more culturally depraved, generation by degeneration by degeneration. We are now in the fourth or fifth degeneration of the American population since the beginning of the 20th century. So what we have to do is concentrate on great projects which emphasize high energy flux density programs, which means programs that should go into areas of greater intensity than the sun itself. And those programs will be the means by which we restore the United States and launch the essential means, the grounds, the chief instruments, the key leading instruments on which we will use for very high-powered drugs, more powerful in their turn intensity than the sun itself. And as Vernadsky understood this process, the human species is unique. The human species is not determined by time. The human species is governed by the rate of increase of the intensity of energy flux density of mankind on the planet. What we need to do is have a society which is oriented toward true discovery, toward true progress, which means exactly that.
I know we're going a little bit longer than we usually do. Maybe I won't ask a final question, but I really wanted to ask you to elaborate on what you're saying on Vernadsky. You breached the subject, so I'm going to just ask a short question on this subject. You made the point that since the beginning of the 20th century, mankind has been enslaved by a Zeusian system, by the Hilbert-Russell attempt to kill creative science. And during the 20th century, it's clear that Vernadsky was taking that on directly, that a Zeusian system as opposed to a Promethean system, where mankind is a completely distinct species that's not of the purely biological animal domain, so-called, but a species that transcends all other species of living creatures. And Vernadsky most characteristically identifies the human species as absolutely distinct from beasts by his use of fire. In an essay that he wrote in 1938 called On the scientific thought as a planetary phenomenon. He writes, he says this explicitly. He says, "I believe that Homo sapiens, or his closest ancestors, were formed not long before the onset of the period of glaciation, or in one of its warmer periods. Man survived the severe cold of that period due to the great discovery that was made at that time in the Paleolithic age, the mastery of fire. The discovery of fire appears to be the first instance in which a living organism masters and makes himself the steward of one of the forces of nature. Undoubtedly, that discovery lies, as we now see, at the basis of the subsequent future increase of mankind and the forces now in his possession." So this is clearly a Promethean view of man, that man's mastery over the forces of nature, typified by his use of fire, makes him absolutely unique, and also that it's this mastery of fire which laid the basis for the entire future increase of the population and productivity of mankind. And so you stated in the discussion this past Wednesday on the weekly report that there really are no limits to the power of the human species. And in fact, we should be thinking about not just exerting mastery over the planet as a whole, but becoming stewards of the solar system in its entirety and eventually the galaxy and beyond. So in that context, maybe you can just say a final word about this mission of endless progress for mankind and how this allows us to transform our idea of mortality and immortality.
Okay. Well, the essentials are elementary. First of all, what's increased in power of mankind is actually located in the chemistry of the human individual. The human individual has nothing to do with the animal kingdom, because there's a barrier, a distinction, which no mere animal can meet, and nor ever will. Animals do not have a notion of the future. That's the difference. Now, where's this future come from in chemistry? It comes in chemistry. So instead of using the idea of abstract fire or some other medium, you have to think of what does this mean? It means that mankind is actually biologically, by using the principles of the increase of the periodic table, the same, that we increase the energy flux density by the development of man. So man becomes a conscious of a means of tool which no animal knows. And that is the creative powers of the human mind. No other beast except humanity has ever manifested to us in any form of record or indication the existence of progress of the species of this type, of growth to higher and higher levels of capability, except the human species itself. Now, we have two problems with this thing. One is people like to believe that they can measure it in terms of sense perception. Now, sense perception is not a competent instrument. Sense perception is like a shadow rather than substance. And it's the substance you have to define. And this comes into where chemistry comes into place. Chemistry starts in the tables of chemistry, which is a 19th century idea, not a 20th century idea. So the 19th century development of the idea of chemistry was finding an order of different elements of the periodic table, or what became the periodic table, and sorting these things out into groups and creating a periodic table over the course of the 19th century. So therefore, at that point, we discovered that the chemical actions which correspond to those elements, was discovered toward the end of the century, that these elements come in an assorted way of order of magnitude. So now when we try to understand mankind as a living species, we say, what's the characteristic of mankind's development, natural development? It's the fact that the human species has some kind of voluntary capability, which no animal has, to create the future by a conscious intention, or an implicitly conscious intention. So mankind is always improving, probably, in its power, which means that as we go from the periodic table as it used to be, we've now gone into very higher energy flux densities of what we call as new replacements or superseding elements in the process of chemistry. This means we have now reached far beyond the capability of any ordinary source of chemistry. We have entered the area of a superchemistry, of increases in energy flux density of the content of action, controllable by man, by the human will. And these things now reached, in terms of experimental pilot testing, increase the power of the sun. That mankind's mind has now reached the point of in experimental work in which the power that mankind wields as science is capable now of designing instruments whose energy flux density will exceed the power of the sun. Which means, and this is the real punchline on this one, that mankind has reached a point where we no longer believe in sense certainty, or should no longer believe in sense certainty. We should recognize that man's idea of sense perception is a mirage. It's a mere shadow cast by something much more powerful, which is the essence of the human individual. That's something else. This something else, by the process of invention, is enabled, actually, and it's been proven in fact so far. What man can do by the human will in this way of increasing energy flux density, mankind is able to reach beyond Earth, as Aristophanes did, in identifying what the significance of the sun is for measuring Earth. And Archimedes never understood that. He was floundering around still for a long time. And the people of the Renaissance had to fix this thing up because he was such an idiot on these matters. He was always Roman, but that was not good enough. So that Aristophanes was the one who understood this. It was Aristophanes who enabled the relatively dumb Archimedes how to apply what he discovered to mapping the region of the Mediterranean Sea. In other words, he extended the experience of the sun, which he himself had perfected, and extended that so Archimedes could be instructed how not to be less stupid than he'd been so far. And this was the transition from Aristophanes' genius into the development of what became the Renaissance. So since that time, the idea of the spiritual feature in life is that what we call spiritual is a power which resides inside the human being, but which actually reflects something that the human being does not know by sense perception. We only knew it by achievement, by practice. We find that we are capable to synthesize by reflecting on the experience of progress of mankind through chemistry. And the way you measure this is in chemistry, to higher and higher chemistries. We use chemistry as a standard, a way of referencing this. But chemistry looks at us, first of all, as if it were objects. But it's not an object. It's a principle. It's the development of a principle, which the human mind can do once the human mind, like Aristophanes, says we are not going to measure events on Earth by living on Earth. We're going to take the shadow cast by the sun, and we're going to measure space beyond sense perception by that standard. So it's this germ of science which comes in that process and settles in the Renaissance itself. That is the source of modern science, as typified such that anyone who does not know that Kepler discovered the solar system is not qualified to be called a scientist. Anyone who rejects Kepler's authority as being the original discoverer of the principle of the solar system is an idiot. and should not be trusted with scientific matters.
Well, with that said, we're going to bring a conclusion to today's webcast. Thank you very much, Lynn, and thanks, Cody, for joining me here, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Stay tuned. Good night.